Hello and welcome back to Jacob's Toys. Today we are going to talk about dyeing action figures. Don't forget to like and subscribe where you can, it is very much appreciated. So I've been asked a number of times whether I dye my action figures when I'm customising. It's never been my go-to choice when it comes to customising, and I'll get into that a little bit later. However, it is a technique that I do use from time to time because it can be quite useful. I picked a handful of different types of figure that I'm going to dye in this tutorial. One of them is Rick Flag, the Mattel Rick Flag from the Suicide Squad. You've got a Fox Magneto and an Astral Doctor Strange as well. So the dye that you want to get your hands on is Rit Dye-More Synthetic. Now, don't want to go for anything other, you don't want to go for fabric dye, etc., because that will not stick to the plastic. This is definitely one that will stick to the plastic and it will stay on it. However, the instructions on the back you don't want to follow. You're going to ignore the instructions completely and you're going to follow the method that we're going to go through here to get the most effective dye onto your figures. It's a decent bottle. You can pick it up from most places. I think they retail on Amazon at about £8. I think it's about $10, and they're quite readily available. They're not that hard to get hold of. This is black, obviously because we're going to go for black in this tutorial. Get yourself a wooden spoon or some kind of stirring instrument. That's also going to get dyed, so make sure that you don't need to use it again. And get yourself a large pan. The larger the better. You can fit in more action figures. As you can see, I just put in 4 there. But you're not going to be able to reuse it. So make sure that it's a pan that you're not planning on cooking your dinner in later that day or even that week. And it's just solely for using when it comes to dyeing action figures. Now the reason I picked these 3 for the tutorial is because they're quite different. The Fox Magneto in the middle there has predominantly got quite a lot of black on it already. The Astral Doctor Strange is obviously that pearlescent colour, and also the Rick Flag is a completely different kind of build to the other 2 because it's a different brand. So we've got Mattel and Hasbro there. I'm also going to do some accessories as well. I've got a handful of guns there as well, some purple ones, some silver ones, some grey ones. And while we're at it, I'm also going to dye this Luke Skywalker Hasbro Black Series, Star Wars Black Series. I've already taken the arms off using the boil and pop method, and I also took the head and neck off. What's nice about these Black Series is the neck comes off as well. It's not just the head, so you can actually dye the whole clothing. Then what we want to do is you want to bend the joins just like this so that the dye gets into all the bends and the joins. Move the feet a little bit around as well. Open the legs up a little bit just so that the dye has the best opportunity to get into all the creases there. Obviously with this one the legs were already black, so I'm just going to focus on the arms and bend at the elbow, pull the shoulders out a little bit and swivel it around a little bit just so that, as I said, the dye can get into all of the little gaps and creases. It's a bit stiff, this particular figure, hence why it's in my fodder. Not quite sure what I'm going to use that for yet, but I'm going to give it a base coat of black. This Doctor Strange I think I'm going to turn into some kind of Sith because I quite like the design, but obviously we don't want it to be like a pearlescent. It's going to have to be black. So make sure that you bend all the joins there, because obviously if you don't, those joins are then going to be on show, and if you've got a colour like pearlescent and you're dyeing it black, then they're going to stand out quite a bit. The Mattel figures, the articulation's a little bit different. Obviously there's some skin still on show, some flesh tone here, but I think when you dye it black, he'll have like a SWAT team or like a shield agent kind of look to him. So that's how we're going to do it. And then what you want to do is make sure that you're all prepped. So I put the heat on quite low. This is an electric oven, and I had it on about 1 or 2 for this, just to make sure that the water was warm. You don't want it boiling over, because obviously if you're putting plastic action figures in boiling water that's bubbling over, it's going to warp them, which can be great if you're obviously popping limbs out or doing some kit bashing. But if you're letting them sit in dye, you do not want them sitting there in boiling water for a long period of time. As I said, for this amount of water I use pretty much the whole bottle. Always make sure you've got some tissue paper handy, because obviously this is dye, and any drips or spills, you don't want them necessarily on your kitchen counter. As you can see, as soon as the dye goes in, the water goes very black, thing to remember when it comes to dyeing is you can't, very the same as painting, you couldn't dye a black action figure white, or a grey action figure, you know, a bright yellow, for example. So the rule of thumb I always use is to kind of go down the colours. So if it's a white action figure, I can dye it black, etc, etc. While that water's heating up, just stir it round, make sure that the dye is all in there. As you can see from the spoon, there's not much dye coming off on the actual spoon at the moment. However, by the end of this, this spoon will be completely black, dyed completely black. But just keep it moving around, keep the dye moving around in the boiling water, or the heated water I should say, just not to confuse anyone, just so that it's nicely moved around and it's equally spread. As you can see, I just dip him in, not much happens. He's got to sit in there for a while, so I just drop one in. I'm quite careful not to obviously touch the water myself, because A, I don't want dye on my hands, and B, it's hot at the moment. So putting them all in there, as you can see, they all fit in there quite comfortably. Just be aware that depending what it is that you are dyeing, it might float. One of the guns that I showed you earlier on, I ended up not doing because it was a cheap kind of bargain store gun, and it just floated around on the top, so it didn't actually work very well. When it comes to actually bending the limbs and stuff as well, you can be a bit more strategic than I have been, so that you can obviously use as much space as possible in that pan. Here goes Luke. As you can see, the Rick flag's just floating up there just above the surface, and as you start moving it around, they'll sort of pop out. So it's just a bit of trial and error to make sure that they're all completely underneath, because the last thing you want is to go through all of this effort only to have like an arm or a foot sticking out of the water, and then that part of the figure not actually be dyed at the end of it. So just why I leave them in there, we'll just add in a little bit more water, just to bring it up. As I said, because I use the whole bottle of dye, sorry, I don't mind topping up a little bit of water because it's not diluting it that much. Purple gun there, and put that one in there as well. A couple of the others. There's like a greeny coloured one, a silver one, and a couple more purple ones. I'm going to try this as well from Hawkeye with because that's purple, same purple plastic as the guns. And while we're at it as well, let's just throw them all in at the same time. There's that cheap one that I told you about. And you can see it just floats up to the surface there. So I do take that out a little bit later. But they all go in, they all sink to the bottom. I'm also going to try some head casts. Here's a Red Guardian head cast I made, MCU Red Guardian head cast that I made before we got the recently revealed 2-pack. So just stir those around. Thing to remember is that the guns and stuff are going to float to the bottom what is directly on the heat. So you need to make sure that you're still constantly moving things around. You're constantly making the move so that they're not sitting on the heat where they could potentially melt or disfigure or even worse. Luckily though, I've never had that happen, but that's because I'm just constantly stirring. So you want to leave this on the heat for around about an hour on a very, very low heat. Just constantly stirring every couple of minutes, just coming back in, coming back out, moving them around, and you'll sort of start to see the dye taking effect. I know other people don't leave it on the heat quite as long. I find that if I leave it on a very, very low heat for a longer period of time, I get better coverage. That's just me personally. Obviously, you can experiment with taking it off the heat, etc. But as long as you're coming in, you're stirring them, you're mixing them around, not much damage is going to happen, but obviously just be aware that they are plastic figures in hot water after all. So keep them in there for about an hour, keep stirring them, keep the heat low, and after about an hour take them out. I also let them sit in the water as it cools down, just to ensure that I can maximise the dye. So these are the figures after being dyed. But what I then do is put them straight into a sink of hot soapy water, just to make sure all the excess dye is off, and then run them under a cold tap to make sure that nothing's warped. Now let's take a little bit of a look at each one closer. This is the Rick Flag one. As you can see, the top of his legs are a little bit of a tan colour still. That is underneath the harsh light. However, certain parts of the figures do dye a different colour. As you can see there, the neck's more of a blue, whereas the arms are black and the bottom legs are black. However, when you take them away from the hard light, it doesn't look as bad, and for fodder figures like these that are just kind of using the background as army builders, it's actually not too bad and works quite well. So look at this Magneto. You can see the chest plates have stayed like a reddy colour, but again that's because of a different type of plastic used. However, the arms have gone a really nice black. Again, they look a little bit blue under this light, but I assure you they are black. As you can see, all the dye has got into the joints there around the elbow. The texture on this is really cool. I don't know what I'm going to use it for. Maybe a Days of Future Past Wolverine custom. Let's have a look at the Doctor Strange. This is dyed really nicely. However, there are two bits here, and I can't figure out why. The dye just hasn't taken to the two bits inside here. As you can see here on the neck, the ink's all gone nicely into it. It really shows the detail up of this figure. All in there in the elbows. As you can see, every part of it has gone black, which is great when it comes to painting. However, again, the midsection there has dyed a slightly different colour, so I might have to touch that up with a little bit of paint. However, from a distance, it's not too noticeable, and it should actually be fine once I've put a few accessories on it. Let's have a little look at the weapons. The weapons have gone really nice. The guns, these were the purple guns, and they've got a nice solid black colour. They'll be great for adding a little bit more detail with some paint. Let's have a look at some of the others. These are the little purple ones. Again, got a really nice black. The dye's gone there. Because there's no kind of creases or anything for the dye to go into, it works really nicely. These were the silver and the green ones. Again, the dye's taken to it really nicely, just because it's one solid piece of plastic. Add a little bit of paint detail and that should be fine. Hawkeye's accessory has gone quite nice. There's a couple of bits there that the dye's not taken to for some reason. And the top where the arrows are has gone a slightly different colour, which works out quite nicely, so they look different. The head casts went really well. Got a nice solid colour. Shows up a lot of the detail there. Makes them ideal for painting. Actually tempted to maybe do this with all my casts, just because it shows the detail up a lot easier than painting with just a primer on. This was a Taskmaster skull that I did, where I filled in the top just to make a skull accessory. Let's have a look at Luke. Luke's actually worked out quite well. However, you can definitely see this bottom bit here is a different type of plastic than the rest, and again around the midsection a different type of plastic, because it's gone a completely different colour than the rest of it. However, not something that can't be touched up with a bit of paint, and it does look a little bit lighter here underneath the harsh light than it does like in real life. However, I'd be happy with this as it is as a base, or could go back and touch up with a little bit of paint a little bit later on. So having a look at them all together in review, I think overall the dyeing method works very well. If you want a base coat for black, you wouldn't necessarily do this and have this as the final stage. This would be obviously a preparation stage for customising a little bit further down the line, but it definitely gives you an all over flat colour to work on that's darker than the original mould. I think that it works quite well. So have a look at, just pop the picture up there of what they looked like before, and you can see there's quite a significant difference, especially in Doctor Strange. The colour's taken really well. I think the lighter the base figure is, the better the overall colour will be after you've finished dyeing. So yeah, and for weapons and accessories, it definitely works well. Thing to remember is that it'll also look very different once you start putting bits back onto it. So I've just put the arms and head and neck back on the Luke Skywalker figure, and as you can see, it really makes the kind of black pop out a little bit. Let's just put his lightsaber in there so I can put him in a bit of a pose. And you know what, the two-tone doesn't actually look too bad, but I definitely will go back and touch that up with a little bit of paint. But when you put a contrasting colour like a flesh tone against it, it definitely makes it stand out and shows the black out better. What's nice is it keeps all the texture of the original figure, whereas with some people, if their paint's too thick, they can lose a little bit of that texture. Whereas for this one, for example, the vest has got a lot of texture in it, and the dyeing method definitely keeps all of that texture there, which is great. And I think this is a good example of how the dye method can work quite well for the right thing. To be honest with you, I don't really use dyes for anything other than going to a black base coat. I've not really experimented with different coloured dyes on different coloured figures. I usually use them for a black base coat, whether I'm doing some dry brushing or picking up on some details. So there we have it. That's how you dye a figure. I hope this tutorial has been useful. Obviously, if it has, please do like, subscribe or share, and stay tuned to the channel for some other customizing tips coming up in the future. Thanks very much.